Welcome to another chilling episode of our True Crime series Part 2. I hope you guys have watched Part 1 of this video. If not, I'll leave a link to the description. Let's get into our video. Number 4. Albert Fish. Albert Fish, whose real name was Hamilton Howard Fish, was an American serial killer and one of the most depraved and sadistic criminals in the history of true crime. He is infamously known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire, due to the horrifying nature of his crimes. Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His early life was marked by hardship, abuse, and instability. He experienced physical and sexual abuse from a young age. Fish's criminal history included various offenses, such as theft, assault, and fraud. He also developed a disturbing obsession with sadomasochism, which involved inflicting pain on himself and others. Fish began a pattern of targeting children in the 1920s. He would often select victims who were vulnerable and from impoverished families. The most infamous crimes attributed to Albert Fish are the brutal murders of children. He would lure young victims to secluded locations, where he would torture, mutilate, and ultimately kill them. In 1934, Fish was arrested in New York City after attempting to send a disturbing letter to the family of one of his victims. He was put on trial for the murder of Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl whose murder he had confessed to in a letter. Number 3. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, USA. He grew up in a seemingly normal household but exhibited troubling behavior from a young age, including an interest in dissecting animals. Dahmer's criminal history began in his teenage years when he was arrested for indecent exposure and later, for sexually assaulting young boys. Despite these early signs, his family was unaware of the extent of his disturbing behavior. Dahmer's killing spree began in 1978, with the murder of a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Over the course of approximately 13 years, Dahmer would go on to murder and dismember 17 men and boys, primarily young gay men of Asian or African American descent. Dahmer's crimes often involved luring his victims to his apartment, drugging them, and then sexually assaulting and murdering them. In July 1991, Dahmer was arrested after a would-be victim escaped from his apartment and flagged down police. Jeffrey Dahmer was tried and found guilty of 16 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. Dahmer was incarcerated in a maximum security prison. On November 28, 1994, he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate. Number 2. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer who murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He was known as the Killer Clown. Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois, on March 17, 1942. He was the second of 6 children born to John Stanley Gacy Sr. and Marion Elaine Gacy. Gacy's father was an alcoholic who was physically and emotionally abusive to his wife and children. Gacy was a troubled child who was often bullied by his peers. He was also sexually abused by a male babysitter when he was 11 years old. These experiences left Gacy with low self-esteem and a need for control. Gacy's criminal activity began in his early 20s. He was arrested several times for petty crimes, including forgery and fraud. In 1968, he was convicted of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released after serving 18 months. After his release from prison, Gacy married and started a family. He also opened a construction company and became active in local politics. However, he continued to commit crimes, including sexual assault and burglary. In 1972, Gacy began to abduct and murder young men. He would lure them to his home, where he would strangle them and then bury their bodies in the crawlspace under his house. Gacy's crimes were finally discovered in 1978 when a teenager who had been abducted by Gacy escaped and led police to his home. Gacy was arrested and confessed to the murders of 33 young men. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. He was 52 years old. Number 1. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy was an American serial killer who murdered over 30 women in the United States between 1974 and 1978. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. He was the unwanted child of Eleanor Louise Cowell, née Cowell, September 21, 1924 to December 23, 2012, a single woman who gave him up for adoption shortly after his birth. Bundy was raised by his adoptive parents, Johnny Culpepper Bundy and Louise Cowell, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was a bright and charming child, but he also had a dark side. He was fascinated by violence and death, and he often told stories about killing animals. In 1965, Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. He dropped out after 2 years and moved to Olympia, Washington, where he worked as a security guard. In 1974, he began his killing spree, which would last for 4 years. Bundy's victims were young women, typically college students. He would often approach them in public places, such as libraries or bus stops, and offer them help. He would then take them to a secluded location and strangle them. Bundy was finally arrested in 1978 after a cross-country manhunt. He was convicted of several murders and sentenced to death. He was executed by the electric chair in 1989. I hope you found this video informative and disturbing. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos like this.